Hi, I'm Jerrid. This is Dylan, and we're with the Simon Anderson team. We've been working together, brokering sales of apartments for just over a decade, investing in apartments for 5 years now. We've learned a lot of lessons along the way, the good and the bad. And today's topic we'd like to focus on is that early phase of how to identify new acquisitions and onboard them and start operating them well so they become truly passive income. So first off, starting with a question for you, Dylan. Before we've bought a property, we're looking in the market, what type of things from an operations perspective are you looking at when we're acquiring a new property?
Great question. I think the first thing that we look at, I just call is what's the business plan? So is this going to be a building that I'd say just steady state operations, we're going to buy and operate similar to the previous owner? Or is it going to be something that's a complete renovation play? And then we're looking at completely different factors about the building, whether it's a gut renovation or a stabilized building. I think that the two biggest aspects of that are what's your budget, how much are you going to spend, and how are you going to execute? So if it's just an existing building, putting together a budget, we're going to interview 3 managers, select a local management company since we're generally having third-party managers, and it's really going to be relying on that initial budget and figure out if we can hit the returns we're looking to hit. If it's a renovation, totally different look at it because we're looking at hiring contractors, budgets, different type of debt, and it's just a different business plan. And that's the first decision factor is what type of investment is it? And you're out there on the hunt when you're looking, I mean, from your perspective, which is much sooner than when I get there, when you're trying to source a new apartment investment, what are the criteria you're looking for to source an investment?
Yeah, I think it's really important, is even when I'm talking to other buyers, that you have criteria. Sometimes people say, send me any deal. The life that a broker remembers you as the any deal guy is 0. And so I like to be really succinct with what we're looking for when I talk to other brokers in other markets so that they think of us when there's a certain opportunity. So usually size, location, and business plan. I come up with that, usually you and I, and then I share that with the brokers. If you find something that meets these criteria, we're interested. So that's just phase 1, being really, really direct and succinct with what we're looking for as opposed to this broad, send us any deal.
So what's an example of that? So if you were hunting down, how would you define what your size is? How do you, location is at Puget Sound? How would you lay that out if you have specific criteria and you're talking to the brokerage community? What guidance would you give them to define that?
Yeah, I think we have a huge advantage. Let's use Seattle, for example, because we spend so much time there, we live there, we own here. And so I'll use that as my example. I'll get pretty detailed and I'll say, I think there's a real opportunity in West Seattle because A, there hasn't been much new development in the last 5 years, and B, it was impacted quite a bit by the pandemic. And I still think the operations in those buildings are lower than they should be because it's been a hard few years to catch up. And so that thesis is my start for location. And then I go over there and say, to be effective, to, bring our investors into this deal, how large does it need to be? And I determine what the average price per unit usually is in that market. So let's say West Seattle, it's $250,000. And I say, okay, for a deal to make sense for us to really dive in, we're going to need it to be 5 million or more. What's 5 million divided by 250? It's 20 units. How much money could we raise? Let's say it's up to 10 million. So that's 40. So now I've said, I want West Seattle, 20 to 40 unit. And I think we've got a great contractor. Let's go for this value add strategy. So now I've told the broker the location. It's pretty specific in West Seattle. I might draw it on a map. I don't like this area. I do like this. I want it 20 to 40 units. And it has to be probably before 1980, but newer than, I don't want a 100-year-old building. 1940, send us what you have.
Yep. What do you expect after you've laid out that criteria? You've talked to maybe multiple brokers who are in the market, active in that market. What do you expect to happen next?
I would love for the phones to start ringing and the opportunities to roll in, but inevitably it's actually, I think, on me to continue to check in with them and see what opportunities they may have. The most important thing I can do as the potential investor or buyer is give critical feedback about the opportunities they do send me. And if it's something I like, moving very quickly. So critical feedback being, hey, thank you for sending this. This is why I don't like it. And it's not to be offensive, it's just to help them define what I'm really looking for. And then if I do like it, to have done my analysis, preliminary underwriting, and talk to you about the business plan before I go back and say, hey, this is really interesting. But I try to move on something that's a fit for our box within 24 hours.
So important to move quickly. You imagine most brokers out there getting calls from multiple buyers. Everyone wants attention paid to them. But I've found on switching to the brokerage side, being clear about what you want and just aggressive, letting them know you're excited about something, giving really good feedback. I've generally said I love all offers. What I don't like is talking to someone, you said it best, is you love fast no's. The slow maybes are killers. It just takes a lot of time, but that fast no, or just some feedback, we're getting in range, or let's go look at this, is always so helpful.
Yeah. So in that phase, and I'll kick it back to you, I've identified, hey, we have this 35 unit in West Seattle. Here's what I think the business plan is. We actually maybe structured an offer. Let's go take a look. What are you looking for in the due diligence phase, whether this is a winner or loser?
Yeah, I think what's really helpful is once we've identified an investment, we've done some preliminary underwriting, is testing that underwriting. So we're thinking we can get these sort of rents, we can get this sort of management strategy. Is just going, I love the physical real estate. So many people do some what they call desktop underwriting. You're sitting there, you're hunting around on Google, you're looking at the neighborhood, you're seeing what comparable properties are renting for. I love the boots on the ground, literally walking the neighborhood, seeing the other properties, seeing the comps, and just looking. If it's a value add, and let's say in-place rents are $1,250 and we think we're going to get $1,500 or $1,600 after renovation, looking at the comps and saying, are we competitive with this other building? Does it make sense? And that is another switch. That's when I have to look at becoming a renter. And that's a whole different lens. And I haven't been a renter in a handful of years, but I think a common mistake is just not looking at it through the renter's eyes and looking at it more through the investor's eyes or the broker's eyes. And to me, that's the test, is if it can pass that next test of muster, if the underwriting makes sense, then we're getting into a much deeper of the analysis of the physical structure of the building, what's the history of the building, how do we get debt. But to me, proving out initially, does the underwriting make sense? Does it make sense for that neighborhood is such an important aspect.
And speaking of, being the renter, what's a way you may embody that? I know we've toured some comparable properties, maybe even spent time in the neighborhood.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's too much for other people. I'm literally talking to people in the neighborhood. I'll see someone walk out of a building and I'll ask them what they like about the neighborhood, what rent are they paying, but really trying to get an understanding of who is the demographic, who's the archetype of a renter in that neighborhood, and putting myself in their shoes and saying, well, I probably work in the neighborhood, live in the neighborhood. Do I need parking? Do I not need parking? How do I get to work? What are the traffic patterns? And trying to understand, I think it's very unlikely that someone's going to live in West Seattle and commute to Bellevue at this point and work at Microsoft or a company over there. So who are the employers nearby? How are they going to live? If it's a really, really high-end unit, they probably want walkable amenities nearby. Sometimes we're buying buildings that are smaller units. Well, if you have a small unit, you probably can't afford a bigger unit, which means you can't afford parking or a car. So are we really going to get $150 or $200 a month for parking in this building? And are we going to keep a big parking lot full? And these are the considerations of getting a bit more granular and seeing if the business plan works. So at this phase, we're going back and forth trying to understand this investment. What are you seeing? What are the biggest common mistakes that are made at this phase of analysis?
What I've run into, and I think can be one of the biggest challenges, is when you end up buying a property that you need to spend a lot of money on that's not going to pay you any rent. And usually this is related to what we call systems or deferred maintenance or capital expenses. But it could be anything from the heating, the plumbing, the roof, where a resident expects that water's going to show up in their tub when they turn the faucet on, right? And they expect that water's not going to come through their roof when it rains.
Yeah.
So if I need to go spend money to ensure that happens, they're not going to pay me any more rent for it. What they will pay me rent for is if I can open up the kitchen or put in some nicer appliances or improve the aesthetics or whatever about the building. So when we're looking at a building and it becomes apparent that a majority or a large portion of our budget may be just bringing this thing up to life, and maybe it was deferred for a long time, it might not be the best use of our money unless the basis, the purchase price, can justify it. So that's one of the mistakes, and one of the opportunities I find is when we're in the building and we start seeing like-kind units, so either the same exact unit layout or very comparable, and I'm looking on the rent roll and one's renting for $1,600 and the other one's renting for $1,200, I can already tell myself, I think we can raise that one from 12 to 16 and start to find some of these what we call loss to lease, or opportunities where it's pretty quick to improve the property operations. And those ones get me most excited because they're very little cost and it's more from a management and operations perspective.
And I think that's a common mistake a lot of people look at. So many times they want to do something. They want to add washers and dryers. They want to reconfigure the unit. And many times it's just an operational play. It's just managing a little bit better. And I think that's an important step, is trying to understand how the previous owner managed it and really understanding what are the things we can do to optimize it that may not cost a lot of money or may not cost any money. It's just being more effective at leasing. There's something you said a second ago about one of the challenges of building systems.
Yeah.
So let's dial back to some of the people that may not have as much experience. Yeah, it's pretty easy to look at siding that's hanging off the building, but how do you determine who's your team? Who do you get involved to figure out you've got an older building? What does the plumbing look like? What is the electrical? Is the roof going to last another 5 or 10 years? How do you get that knowledge if you don't have it day one?
Yeah. It's interesting. Over the progression, we've been investing for about 5 years now. My stance on this has changed. Initially, it was like, just call an inspector and whatever they say goes. But at the end of the day, the inspector's not really liable for you determining whether this is a good investment or a bad one. And so I think it's a combination of taking what the inspector says and then talking to some contractors on what it will cost to cure some of these challenges that you run into. And so on the last property that we're acquiring actually this week that we toured, we got an inspection report. They pointed out a few challenges, and then we had a few different vendors go through and bid those. So we're working with real numbers instead of trying to guess based on an inspector who doesn't do this works assessment of what it may cost. And not only are we getting the cost, but then we understand from that contractor what the permitting may look like and the feasibility overall. So I think really leveraging a network of vendors, and I think any good broker should have some decent contacts. As you grow in your investing career, you should start to gain your own. And I think that's a really tough thing to build. We'll probably talk about in a later session is that vendor list.
Yeah.
It's critical.
Having that team super important. Another aspect, back to what you said about not taking what they say as verbatim, I think what really separates the great investors from the average is getting all of these opinions, but making their own decision. Having been an attorney for the last 20 years, I have a lot of experience in the law, but I have a lot of clients that whatever their attorney says goes. And some of the best clients, they'll get an inspection report. They may push back on a couple of items. They may say that isn't necessary. Same thing on the legal side. Attorneys offer great advice, but I think having this community, knowing which advice is the one to take and which one is just more feedback or just background noise is super important.
Yeah. Flipping it around, we're touring the property, inspecting it. I don't know if you've ever seen a broker's package with some inflated numbers or some big story to buy into. How are you sifting through those stories and coming up with your own thesis to not make what I think some may is that mistake of just taking one person's opinion and saying, that's my truth, I'm going to run with it.
Yeah. I think there's a bit of art and a little bit of science to it. I think there's no replacement for doing your own homework. So I think the number one mistake is setting rents, is you get too lofty of rents and you can never get there. And a lot of times you're trying to layer on new rents, folding in tenants paying for utilities that didn't previously pay for utilities or pets or parking. And it takes too long, or it's just too hard to get to that number. So I think doing your own research is key. And I think the other is expanding that team, is having your property manager. This happened the other day. I was talking to a gentleman who was looking to hire a property manager. And I said, what's their budget? And he said, I don't have a budget. I just have a proposal. And they showed me how many buildings they manage. Is getting a budget from that manager, and then going through line item and asking them, current insurance is X. You're saying it's going to be X minus 10%. How are you getting that cheaper? But really going through, getting some outside experts in, and then folding in previous operations, what the broker is saying, and some third-party opinions in the market. And then I often say, you've heard me say over the years, the truth usually is somewhere in the middle. And generally you're looking and using some gut, some numbers. I think insurance is pretty easy. You hadn't get quotes from insurance, but you might get 2 or 3 proposals from different property managers, how they'd operate it, and then take your own research. And I think it's a blend of all of those aspects that you're circling and you're finally trying to get to that truth where you feel comfortable?
Yeah, that's fair. Theme I'm noticing in acquisitions is get the experts' opinions of the managers on how to operate it, the inspectors on what may be wrong. We need to go validate these things ourselves.
Well, speaking of lots of opinions, a big polarizing topic in the market today, and probably in what we're seeing in how brokers are presenting opportunities and how lenders are seeing them and investors are. Do you invest in Seattle? Yeah. And what are the pros and cons? What are you hearing there in the marketplace of reasons why people don't feel comfortable in Seattle? And we're coming in on closing over 20 sales so far in the last 6 months. A lot of them are in Seattle. What are you hearing of why people have faith in coming into this market?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some benefits and drawbacks to owning in a city like Seattle. I'd say high top line benefits. It's very high demand. It's a gateway city, and I've seen tons of progress from the business front, starting to work with our legislative front to really improve what's going on in the city and for the longer term vision. One interesting thing, which is a little more the operations side, but during the pandemic, when there was these systemic issues with bad debt and collections, our properties in Seattle didn't really deal with it. The people that lived here and paid that higher rent really wanted to maintain their credit score and their relationship with those landlords, because I knew they're going to be finding another apartment, maybe not in this city, but another. And that was extremely important. Whereas maybe in the suburbs that weren't as impacted by some of the tougher social issues that were impacting Seattle, we had some non-payment in properties as high as 10 or 20% that still exists. And so I think you're dealing with a different tenant, and knowing that they have high expectations to be in Seattle. They may pay a little bit more rent, but they also might be a little bit more responsible in how they care for their unit and their home. So I thought that was interesting. But as far as buying in Seattle, we've not bought here in a few years, and I think we're starting to think it's quite a good buy because the basis is quite good. And what I mean by that is the price it costs me just generally per unit to buy in the city of Seattle now is not much more, or could be less than some suburbs, even like Tacoma, which is a great city, great opportunities. But if I can buy in Seattle versus Tacoma for nearly the same price, I think the long-term play here is stronger. I think there's plenty of upside to be had in a market like Tacoma, but Seattle has a proven track record of being this incredible gateway city. So I feel really comfortable investing here right now. A couple of years ago, when the average price for units were some places 30 or 40% higher, hard to make that work at the time.
Yeah.
Had dinner with a client of ours last night, and he's like, you make your money on the buy. So in spite of everything else, I think Seattle's a fantastic city. Yes, we're always going to have our challenges, which are going to be, seems like, more legislative. But we hire these professional managers for a reason. They keep up with the legislation, and they're comfortable operating with that. So that's one question we always ask them is, do you understand the local laws, whether it's here or somewhere else? And how do you feel about them? How do you adapt to them? Most of the professional management companies are pretty good. I think where you hear about in the news that someone's really getting hamstrung by some new policy, they operate themselves, they only have a handful of units and they can't keep up. I totally understand that. So that's why I'm bullish on Seattle as from an economic perspective, but really need to leverage professionals in the market to be able to operate our buildings with some challenges from legislation.
Yeah, I agree. The world's changed. The politics have changed. I think the biggest thing I've experienced over the years is just that effect of higher incomes. Yeah. And if you have higher incomes, and if you just, as simple as looking at the cost of the unit and where incomes are, yeah. I think we're seeing it tilt in favor of Seattle, especially people coming back to the city, employers having them come back. Yeah. Average wage versus price to buy, that equation is making a lot more sense in Seattle. Yeah. And I think the other fact that people haven't really acknowledged yet is rents haven't grown here, and a lot of investors invest based on what happened the last 6 or 12 months. I'd flip that around and say there's a lot of pent-up demand, and because rents have not grown here compared to the suburbs during COVID and even the east side with a lot of employers moving over there, there's a huge pent-up demand that when people get back to work here and start living in these neighborhoods, we're going to see rents really push when really they've been fairly tepid growth the last several years.
Yeah. Speaking of the city of Seattle, from an operating perspective, I think maybe even from a vendor pool's perspective, what are some advantages to owning in a city like Seattle versus maybe a smaller suburb or town we've invested in like Spokane?
Yeah. I mean, I'd say the number one benefit of being in a more mature market with lots of competition for renters, competition for vendors is just the quality of the vendor pool is higher. And I'd say in a market like Seattle, there's quite a few of property managers that are trying to compete for people's business. They hire better staff. A lot of our property managers have attorneys on retainer that are trying to understand the new legislation, the new laws, get ahead of it. And they understand these policies and programs. So when you're in another market, just take something like the MFTE program. Really complicated program. How do you screen residents? How do you have compliance for that so you can rent these units that are below market rent? There's certain criteria. Every manager in Seattle is very experienced with that program. But if they implement that in another market, those managers are scrambling for a couple of years to figure out how to operate in this new environment. So I think by just being in an environment where you have a lot more competition for vendors, the overall competency gets higher. And it is challenging. And I think that what we've always said is you can't just hire any vendor and rely on them completely. I think whether it's your attorney, whether it's your architect, whether it's your property manager, you need to understand how to work with them. But when you have a higher baseline of skill and competency, it is going to be the number one determining factor of how your investment operates after you stabilize it and you get the new manager in. If you're doing renovations, you complete them, is how they're managing day to day. Because the number one thing we have is our time, and the sooner you can peel away and go look for the next investment, the better off you are. So Jerrid, when you're analyzing new investments and you're on the acquisition front, what are some tips and tricks that you have for people out there a little less experienced than yourself in finding that new investment?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I've touched on a few of them, but to summarize, I think the keys are identifying what your acquisition criteria is or are, so you can be clear with any brokers or owners in the market that what you're looking for. Next is moving quickly to a no or a yes is huge. If you like an opportunity, there's a high probability someone else will as well. Yep. Move quickly, say what you want to do, execute, don't play games. And then the third, it sounds maybe a little bit favoriting what we do, but like treat your broker well. You know, I just start with when I'm in a new market, like here's how I'm going to pay you. And then they want to bring us opportunities instead of, well, send the opportunities and we'll figure out how you may get paid later on. It's like, not that motivating. So whether it's us or any other broker, just tell them how you're going to get them paid. Seems like the opportunities show up a little bit sooner and faster. So.
Yeah. I remember every time I've been at that bar and I'm trying to get served that extra tip, just all of a sudden that next drink comes that much faster. Yeah. Not that much different for investments. Yeah. It is, you're a great buyer, quick yeses, quick nos, do what you say you're going to do. You'll get repeat business and opportunities coming back.
Absolutely. And then on the flip side, operating, you've acquired the property, it's up and running. How much can you impact how it operates, and where have you found some tips and tricks there?
Yeah, I think the number one aspect is, for me, it's budgeting, is set a budget early so you have something to benchmark to. Oftentimes people operate with no plan and say having no plan is no plan. And it's really true, because you can't really understand where you are if you don't have some benchmark. So I'd say the first thing is get a good budget. You'll completely be wrong the first year or so, and it's usually taken a year or two to stabilize a property. So the next thing after you've developed a budget, you've got buy-in, is just the frequency you're talking to your manager. I think a great tip is set routine calls and talk to your manager frequently. Go by the property, look at how it's operating. If you've got a good manager, usually you're one of many. They have a lot of clients to service. And generally when they know that you care, they start to care more often. And generally when you're paying that much attention and you're really caring and getting into the details, and you're giving them enough time to get their job done and being collaborative and not being too squeaky of a wheel, you'll start to see the operations continue to tick up and get better and better over time. And just the same, when you peel back, they generally do as well. So staying highly involved is super important.
Thanks for joining us today. If you want to learn more about investing in apartment buildings in the Puget Sound, feel free to reach out to us or follow us on the socials.